The sad thing about modern filmmaking today and modern history today is that there are so many revisionist historians that try to blatantly lie about things that could be so easily researched and proven wrong. One of those things is this claim that there has never been a majority or all black cast in American films, which is a very absurd statement. Furthermore, the sad truth with modern filmmaking is that many filmmakers, including people who I work with, believe that Hollywood is the end all be all for filmmakers. However, throughout the history of American film, there have been countless of filmmakers who could care less about selling their souls to the Hollywood B system. And throughout the history of so-called black cinema, there was a so-called movement, a movement from 1915 until about the 1950s, where so-called black filmmakers had their own studio systems, aka Black Hollywood, if you want to call it as such. Many people call this era of so-called black filmmaking the race film era, where many famous black actors such as Sidney Poitier came out from. But there was one director that stood out in this era. Some historians believe because of this director, the race film era was birthed. Verily, verily, I say this director has been, and in my opinion, was the most successful so-called black filmmaker of the first half of the 20th century. This man is the very famous, one and only Oscar Micheaux. Now, unfortunately, a lot of his films, just like many films before the 1930s, were lost or destroyed. But one of the first films that Oscar Micheaux created and directed was the 1920 film Within Our Gates, starring the First Lady of the Screen, Evelyn Preer. This silent film is a very much not for the faint of heart because it tackles on some issues that hindered the so-called black community at the time for their struggle for progress. Oscar Micheaux himself stated, and I quote, "I want to show the world that the Negro is not what the movies have pictured him to be. I want to show him in his rightful place as a citizen, businessman, and property owner." So, what this means was he wanted to counter those negative stereotypes that you saw so often in films of the time, such as D.W. Griffith's film Birth of a Nation. Micheaux purposed himself to portray so-called blacks as complex individuals with agency, facing real-world struggles against racism, their own vices, and economic exploitations. And that is what this film Within Our Gates touches upon. From a 1920s interview, Oscar Micheaux said, "This picture has a moral. It teaches the Negro the value of education, thrift, and home ownership." Hence, with these two quotes from Oscar Micheaux, this is why the main theme or the main question that is being answered throughout this film is, what are the rocks in the way of uplifting an unfortunate group of souls? And that is where we are going to answer as we analyze this film. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm your host, Paige. Let's get into it. Within Our Gates focuses on a young, resilient so-called black woman named Sylvia Landry, played by Evelyn Preer, who becomes a teacher at a school in the deep rural South after love was lost thanks to the scoundrel scheme of her cousin Alma. While she is a teacher, the school runs into financial problems, and Sylvia takes the lead to raise money by going up north to Chicago for the school that she teaches at to raise about $5,000. Sylvia Landry's story is a bittersweet story. Her character is one that had to deal with many obstacles. But despite the immense challenges she faced, she remained committed to her goals and ultimately serves as a symbol of hope and inspiration for her community. Let us actually take some time and go through the rocks that stood in the way of her goals. In life, the support of family is always a beautiful and powerful thing. However, for Sylvia Landry, we start off the film with her getting betrayed by her cousin, who is her only family member that we know of at the beginning of the film. Before Sylvia Landry became a teacher, she was in Chicago visiting her cousin Alma and waiting for Conrad, Sylvia's lover, to return from Canada to marry Sylvia. Here lies the two issues with Sylvia's family. The first issue was that Alma was secretly in love with Conrad. Secondly, Alma's stepbrother, Larry, was secretly in love with Sylvia, our main protagonist. Larry was a man of bad character who got away with murdering a gambler who tried to cheat him. Larry tried his best to woo Sylvia, but she wasn't interested in him, for her heart longed for Conrad. When Conrad finally arrived to see Sylvia, Alma contrived a scheme arranging Sylvia to be in a compromising situation where it looked like she was in an affair with another man. Unbeknownst to Sylvia, when she arrived back to her cousin's place to see Conrad, the man she wants to marry, she ends up getting choked out by him because he thinks she is cheating on him. Alma, who is the cause of the whole situation, gets Conrad off of her, and Conrad leaves to Brazil without marrying Sylvia, calling off the marriage. Sylvia returns back down south. Sylvia wanted to have a happy marriage, but because of the envy and covetous nature of her cousin, the goal of marriage was put at a halt. We read in the scriptures in Exodus chapter 20, verse 17, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservants, nor his maidservants, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything is thy neighbor's." Therefore, the lesson we can learn from here is that just because people are your own blood or your own family, that doesn't mean they are negated from being envious of your progress or them coveting what you have. And sadly, many times people don't get where they want to be because family sometimes holds them back on their purpose. Sylvia was not a woman born of wealth, nor was the school she taught at filled with wealth as well. After the whole Conrad situation, she moved and helped a minister named Reverend Jacobs run an overcrowded school for so-called black children in the rural deep south called Piney Woods School. She witnessed firsthand the lack of resources and the desperate need for quality education in her community. Her, being an educated woman herself, valued so-called black folks in her community receiving a proper and quality education. One of the reasons being is because she recognized the power of education as a tool for empowerment and liberation, a way for so-called black communities to break free from poverty and discrimination. Very much in line with the ideology of Booker T. Washington. When Reverend Jacobs couldn't continue the school due to lack of funding by the state, Sylvia decided to go up north and raise $5,000 to keep Piney Woods open. One day, while she was walking down the northern streets, a little child was in the middle of the street, which she saved from getting hit by a car. Unfortunately, she was hit by a car instead. She survived, and while recovering in the hospital, the owner of the car, Mrs. Elena Warwick, went to visit her. Mrs. Warwick was a wealthy philanthropist, and when she learns about the reason Sylvia is in Chicago, she decides to give Sylvia the money she needed to raise for the school and then some, especially after Mr. Stratton, a friend of Mrs. Warwick, tried to dissuade her from giving her money to Sylvia for Piney Woods. Though poverty was a rock that stood in the way of Sylvia and the school that she hoped to prosper, she remained resilient. That was due to her commitment to education and community upliftment, and her unwavering belief in justice set a powerful example for others. Through her actions, Sylvia offers a glimpse of what overcoming poverty can truly mean. Not just individual financial security, but for something that could benefit her community that she belonged to and loved. Booker T. Washington once stated, "There is another class of colored people who make a business of keeping the troubles, the wrongs, and the hardships of the Negro race before the public. Having learned that they are able to make a living out of their troubles, they have grown into the subtle habits of advertising their wrongs, partly because they want sympathy and partly because it pays. Some of these people do not want the Negro to lose his grievances because they do not want to lose their jobs." In this film, we see this class from multiple characters. The first character we see this from is Ned, who is a preacher at a church in Chicago, who Mrs. Stratton tried to suggest to Mrs. Warwick, as she, Mrs. Stratton, felt that old Ned was one of them good Negroes. However, Ned was a man who preached that the white man was going to hell and the black man was going to heaven, a hate-filled speech. We find out that also that the only reason he, Ned, was allowed to preach that way and get paid a heapful amount of money is because he was a sellout and was in the pockets of the local so-called white folks. Fortunately, old Ned does reveal that he knows what he's doing is wrong and is somewhat sorrowful about it. But the question is that we never get answered is, does he ever stop? We don't know. The other character of that class in this film is Ephraim. We are introduced to him towards the end of the film when we learned about Sylvia's past prior to her being a teacher and prior to her relationship with Conrad. Sylvia was an adopted child given to the Landry family, who were a poor so-called black family. Ephraim was the, and I quote, old faithful servant for Mr. Griddlestone, the so-called white landlord of the town they resided in. Ephraim was more concerned about the lives of so-called white folks and how he is able to fit in with their society instead of concerning himself with the upliftment of his own community. Because of Ephraim, the Landry family ended up getting cheated out of their earnings because of Ephraim's instigating and not wanting to see so-called blacks rise above their unfortunate situation. Mr. Griddlestone ended up getting murdered by a local so-called white man who was most likely trying to kill Senior Landry, Sylvia's foster father. And Ephraim, who didn't see where the gunshot came from, but only saw Senior Landry holding the gun over his master's head, decided to run into town and ignorantly and falsely accuse the Landrys, a black family, of killing Mr. Griddlestone, a white man. In effect, a lynch mob was formed, and the Landrys ran into the wilderness for they were being hunted by that lynch mob. As the lynch mob was becoming more and more restless, and Ephraim thinking he was good and finally accepted by his gods, the so-called white folks, they turned on him. With divine justice, as the film states, he was lynched. He was a man without a country, and did not even know it nor understand it. Old Ned and Ephraim were Micheaux's response to how D.W. Griffiths characterized quote-unquote faithful souls, aka the good black folk. Old Ned was the embodiment of Paul Laurence Dunbar's We Wear the Mask, which was actually a poem that most so-called blacks of the early 20th century would have learned in church or school. And the poem goes as such. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. With torn and bleeding hearts we smile, and mouth with myriad subtleties. Why should the world be overwise, in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. We smile, but, O great Christ, our cries to thee from tortured souls arise. We sing, but oh, the clay is vile beneath our feet, and long the mile. But let the world dream otherwise. We wear the mask. The last character of this class is Larry, Alma's crooked cousin who has feelings for Sylvia. After Sylvia receives the $50,000 and returns to the South, Larry ends up running into her while being on the run from the police. Larry blackmails Sylvia to steal the money from the school and give it to him lest he exposes her past, which we will get into later. Larry was a man that, though he was fond of Sylvia, he clashed with Sylvia when it came to the matters of life. Sylvia pushed for education and self-reliance to uplift yourself out of poverty or obstacles. Larry, however, was a man who sought for immediate resources and used survival tactics, even if that meant he had to compromise his virtues. His story became a cautionary tale because he eventually, while trying to break into someone's house and steal their wealth, the police ended up finding him and killing him, which his death shows this. Even as a so-called black man, if you choose to rely on deception and exploitation, you will fall eventually. As the scripture says, pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. These three characters represent people who do try to hinder their own community, whether they do it intentionally or ignorantly. These three people in this film serves as a warning for us to be aware of those type of people in that class. Of course, one of the rocks in this film that stood in Sylvia's way of progress is the issue of racism. Sylvia constantly encounters blatant racism, from prejudiced townspeople to the violent threat of white mobs to individuals that look down upon her. Mrs. Geraldine Stratton, who was a friend of Mrs. Warwick, who ended up giving money to Sylvia for the school, Mrs. Stratton believed that so-called black folks were inferior and advocated for forced legalized segregation. Thankfully, her attempts to dissuade Mrs. Warwick to give Sylvia money failed. The other moment was with the Griddlestones. Yes, I said the Griddlestones plurally because when the lynch mob conducted a manhunt on the Landrys due to the false accusation of the murder of Mr. Philip Griddlestone, the landlord, one of the members of the mob was his brother, Armand Griddlestone. Armand found Sylvia in hiding and chased her and tried to forcibly defile her. However, when he sees a scar on her chest after she faints, he realized that she was his daughter, born of his marriage to a local black woman. This is where us, the audience, realize that Sylvia is of mixed race ancestry. Thankfully, he stopped what he was planning to do and let her be, and also paid for her education. But of course, we had to talk about the lynch mob. The lynch mob hunted down a family of innocent so-called black folks based off of a lie. Sadly, Sylvia's family, which included her mother, father, and even her little brother Emil, were captured and eventually lynched, with the exception of Emil, who was able to escape after nearly getting pierced with a shooting bullet. This will cause an internal obstacle of grief and trauma that anyone will have a hard time getting through. The loss of her family leaves Sylvia emotionally scarred and vulnerable to self-doubt. This emotional burden can make it difficult for her to maintain her unwavering determination. But the lesson we can learn is that resiliency and not allowing the evils of this world hinder where you want to go is a powerful trait to have. And with having that trait, one can uplift themselves and achieve true progress mentally, socially, and spiritually. Now don't worry, this film does end on a good and sweet note. But throughout this film, we observed the many rocks that laid ahead on Sylvia's path. Some rocks were external, such as racism, family betrayal, community pride, and lack of support and poverty. But then you had some rocks which was internal, such as Sylvia's melancholy, in which she feels isolated and misunderstood because of the lack of widespread support, which can be emotionally draining and test her resolve. But then you also have the trauma of losing her family in one of the worst ways possible, based off of a lie and by a system that sadly oppresses her and her community. But she overcame those rocks in her paths. And again, we should appreciate Sylvia's strength and resilience. Despite the immense challenges she faces, she remains committed to her goals and ultimately serves as a symbol of hope and inspiration for her community. I hope you enjoyed this analysis and piqued your interest to watch this movie for yourselves if you haven't, and to watch more of Oscar Micheaux's film. If you did enjoy this and wish I give more content like this, please like, subscribe, and comment and share the knowledge with the folks and kinfolks. My Cash App and Zelle is in the link description if you feel so kind to support this channel financially. Until next time, peace.